Hello guys, and today we are going to have a look at the space race. So that is the next topic in our GCSE course. That's what we get to next. And we're moving away from the war in Asia, the consequences of that, the formation of NATO, the formation of the Warsaw Pacts, and we're starting to look at some of these events that happen that are perhaps over a much longer period of time and are in isolation. So we look at the space race today, and I'm going to talk to you about the arms race, which will come tomorrow. Okay, so two things that happen in isolation. They're their own event. They happen over a long period of time, 20 or so years, and they almost have their own mini Cold War in just the space race. So we see the two sides compete against each other. Now, I'm starting off somewhere completely random, but I'm going to something which I personally love. I'm sure many of you do too, and that's pizza. In 2001, Pizza Hut became the first pizza delivery service to deliver to space, and they delivered to the International Space Station. This pizza, I think it was a pepperoni pizza, to be honest, to be really specific there. But a normal pepperoni pizza, what does it cost? £10, 15, 20 at an absolute push. This pizza cost Pizza Hut $1 million. They paid the USSR they paid Russia $1 million to have this as advertising. I guess it's, the 2000s version of Instagram. You pay an Instagram star all this money to pose with a Pizza Hut pizza. Well, this was it back in the day. So Pizza Hut delivered their pizza to the space station, the International Space Station, and a Russian astronaut ate his pizza, took a photograph, and that was, a massive advertising campaign. Now, in much more recent times, Domino's, I guess what you might call Pizza Hut's competition, want to set up the first restaurant on the moon. This is a sketch that has been drawn of what they want it to look like, a two-story restaurant, even though nobody goes to the moon anymore. And that's Domino's Japan. So they want to be the first pizza service to set up their own restaurant on the moon. So what I thought was interesting about this is it's a competition. We have one service, pizza delivery, and we have two companies, and both of them are competing to be the first person or the first company to achieve something. Now that is absolutely symbolic of the space race. If we switch up Pizza Hut and Domino's for the USSR and the USA, we get the space race. Two countries that are competing to achieve something, to look dominant, to look powerful, to look successful, to look like the winners in the world in the same arena. The arena we're looking at is space, something highly fascinating, completely unexplored. If you can conquer space, well, then the world is nothing, isn't it? These two countries, the USA, the USSR, are competing to be the most dominant superpower on Earth. Well, what can you say more than I've conquered space to prove that you deserve that title, okay? So we are leaving our pizza behind. Sorry if I've just created an appetite there for you. And we're going to kind of the 50s. We're going to start in the 50s. We're going to work our way through to the 1970s. And we're going to explore what happens in this competition for space. Right, so our first event, okay? Now, the period we're going to look at in total is about 12 years. We go from 57, the very first satellite gets into space, what I'm about to talk to you about in a minute, and then all the way up to 1969, first man on the moon. So in 12 years, we go from a tiny piece of metal that looks like this, obviously super intelligent, and some crazy engineering gone on to create that. But we have a piece of metal in space which, has quite mediocre capacities. Its batteries die very, very quickly. It only lasts 22 days to be precise. And we get to 12 years later, a man being able to walk on the moon outside of a spacecraft. So a huge amount of effort and money and technology has gone into this in just a 12-year span. But let's start here. So the very first success we see in the space race is Sputnik 1. Now, this is launched in 1957 in October, and it's the first man-made satellite successfully launched into orbit. It is released by the Soviets, so it shows a very, very good success for them. America are competing at the same time, are developing at the same time, and the Soviets do win this particular competition, I guess, the first satellite in space. So they send out the satellite and it transmits radio signals, gives them information about the atmosphere. It lasts 22 days, like I said, until it falls back to Earth because its batteries die. Okay, so Sputnik 1, the first satellite, man-made satellite in space, Soviets. Right, same year, 1 month later, we get Sputnik 2, okay? So the second craft into space and the second big milestone in the space race. Now, again, launched by the Soviets, and we're in November of the same year, 1957. Now, this was I guess, more interesting spacecraft. It's still relatively small, if we can see the picture, and it was the first living animal to be launched into space. Now, the Soviets launched this little dog here called Laika, and really sadly, Laika did die of overheating when she was in space. She doesn't, last more than a couple of hours, to be honest. But at the time, the USSR don't publish this fact, as we can understand. Very, very bad publicity for them, and the use of propaganda, as we know, is really integral to the Soviet campaign. So the second big milestone, the first animal in space, is achieved by the Soviets. So that's 1 and 2, satellite and animal in space, both Soviets, and that's with the dog Laika, Sputnik 2 in 1957. Okay, so you're thinking finally America make a impact on this space race. And they do in 1958. They get their craft Explorer 1 in January of 1958 into space. This is a satellite, works in a similar way to the USSR's, the Soviet Union's Sputnik 1. It orbits and it sends down transmissions for 4 months before the batteries die, and it falls back to Earth. So nothing new from the Americans, none of the new milestones, but I guess we might say they've kind of caught up with the Soviet Union. Okay, so we're back to the Soviet Union, and in 1960 they launched their next spacecraft, and that is Sputnik 5. Now, this time, not only do they want to try to better the failings of the Laika incident, but they want to better it. So they not only launched 1 dog, but they launched 2 dogs into space on Sputnik 5 in 1960. Their names are Belka and Strelka. A grey rabbit, 40 mice, my little mouse down there, 2 rats, and some flies, just because why not? And they send all of these animals in Sputnik 5 in this spacecraft, very, very tiny spacecraft, and up it goes. This time around, they are successful, and all animals return to Earth after spending the day orbiting the Earth. So they return. What a great day out. We're at the moment having to go on picnics and things like that in the park. These guys went and orbited the Earth for their day out, and all got back unharmed. So Sputnik 5, 1960, I guess this is another milestone of a successful living trip for animals in space, again, won by the Soviets. Okay, so the Americans, again, I guess what we might call catching up. But in 1961, they send in Ham, the Astro chimp. Ham is sent on an American spacecraft. He goes up into space, and within 5 minutes, he is able to pull a lever. So I guess they're trying to make the point that they've trained an animal to do an action in space. And Ham actually makes it all the way back to Earth with only a bruised nose, which is excellent. We're very glad that no animals were harmed, I guess, in this process. So Ham, the Astro chimp, is the USA's response to Sputnik 5 and all of those animals that the Soviet Union sent up into space. And in 1961, they successfully get a chimp back down to Earth. Right, I guess this is where we've kind of been leading to, but 1961, finally, the Soviet Union managed to get a man in space. So yet again, the next milestone, the first man in space, is won by the Soviet Union. And in 1961, they send Yuri Gagarin, who is a 27-year-old pilot, space pilot, up into space. And he's the first human in space. His whole mission lasts 108 minutes. His aircraft is later sold at Sotheby's in 1993 for, I'm sure, an extortionate price. But, what a big successful moment for the Soviet Union. They have managed to get a man in space and back again. So kind of heralded and idolized was Yuri Gagarin, that they even built him a massive statue. This statue you can see in Moscow in Russia. And so he was seen as a hero to the Russian people. You know, what a symbolic sign. He literally represented as a metaphor that kind of defeat of America, that we are actually better than you. We have better intelligence, we have better engineering than you do at this moment in time. So 1961, the Soviets succeed yet again with another milestone, and they get the first man in space. Okay, not to be outdone, but the next moment is the first woman in space. 2 years later, in 1963, Valentina Tereshkova, God, I've got to say this right, Tereshkova, becomes the first woman in space. She spends 3 days there. She performs various tests on her own body to try and get some evidence and data of how space affects the female body. And yet again, we're going to return to that point. It is the Soviet Union. I've put a picture here of her training, a picture here of her in her military uniform. But the Soviets, therefore, have got the first man in space and the first woman in space. So we're kind of thinking, what are America doing? They haven't really been very present in this particular competition, have they? Right, 1965, the Soviets do it yet again, and their astronaut Alexei Leonov is the first person to spacewalk in space. So he leaves his aircraft for a total of 12 minutes and he walks through space. I say walk, he's not walking, is he? He's floating. But the picture here, you know, like how we've seen in modern day Hollywood blockbusters about space, when the astronaut goes off and they're attached to the spacecraft with a tube and they're in their spacesuit and they're in space without the aircraft. Okay, so the Soviets, first man, first woman, first spacewalk outside of the aircraft. Again, where are the Americans? Right, I guess we might say they saved the best till last, but finally America make their appearance, and Apollo 11 lands on the moon in 1969. Probably one of the most famous events in recent history. I think most people know about the Apollo 11 flight and Neil Armstrong landing on the moon. And we all know those famous words, don't we? One small step for man, one giant step for mankind. Neil Armstrong is the first man to walk on the moon. He's followed by his partner, Buzz Aldrin. And fun fact for you, very helpful for pub quizzes, the third man who didn't make it on the moon but stayed in the aircraft, his name was Michael Collins. So Apollo 11 lands on the moon. They stay there for about 2.5 hours. They obviously put the flag in and then they return safely to Earth. So it seems slightly unfair, doesn't it? The Soviets have pretty much won every single milestone, been ahead on this whole journey. And yet it's America who really do that kind of, that big moment of a man on the moon and have won that place in history. You know, we don't really talk about Yuri Gagarin. We don't really talk about Laika the dog. We talk about Neil Armstrong. So there's kind of, you know, a summary really of all of the main events that happen. In a moment, I'm going to just take you through a further summary to make sure we've really got it in our heads. But what we need to know really from all of that is that most of those milestones are won by the Soviets. First satellite, first dog, first living animal to then return, still living, first man, first woman, first spacewalk, Soviets, Apollo 11, first man on the moon, Americans. You know, I'm not going to go into all the controversy over whether this is real or not. We know it exists. If you want to look into it, I'm sure there's hundreds of videos you can find about, you know, all of those debates. But Apollo 11, 1969, Neil Armstrong lands on the moon. Right, a final summary for you, just so you absolutely have it. You know, I would pause right now and maybe take some notes if you want to, but we've got the Soviet Union, and I think listing it out like this really shows kind of, you know, the energy, the effort, the money that the Soviet Union put into trying to win this space race. The 4 things there: first satellite, first animal, first man, first woman. I haven't put there, but also first spacewalk. And over here, the Americans, they just have the first man on the moon, but really that's the thing that matters. Right, I'm going to end just briefly before I talk to you about why this is so important with this. Now, I've got here a collection of 5 men, if I, you know, get out of the way so we can see them all. And these men are from 2 countries. They're from the USA and they're from the USSR. This seems very strange. These are two sides who have constantly fought against each other for the past 20 years in this space race, and yet we have them alongside each other posing for a photograph. Now, not only did these men pose for a photograph together, but they also went up into space together. And in 1975, we had the Apollo-Soyuz project, which was the first joint American and Soviet flight, marking the end of the space race. So this flight really marked the end of the kind of turbulent years of the Cold War. And it comes at the same time as the détente, the relaxation. And if you know about that, you'll understand. If you don't, we're going to get there a bit later on. But the détente came in the 70s and was a moment where the Cold War started to relax, calm down, and the aggression of the two sides kind of diminished. So Apollo-Soyuz was kind of a symbolic metaphor, a representation of that détente, that relaxation, and the fact that they're now working together again. Okay, so as a summary, you know, why did the space race happen? Well, both sides want to show that they had better, superior technology. It's a key area for propaganda, you know, imagery of we're dominating space, therefore we're dominating the world. You can find huge amounts of Soviet and American propaganda about this. There is also the very, very real threat, and it's a very real fear of the Americans that the USSR are going to use space to launch missiles. And that's how the space race and the arms race kind of entwine themselves. So America are really fearful that the USSR are going to launch missiles from space, which will therefore kind of overcome the need for bases and ground bases within striking distance of America. You know, if you have the power to launch missiles from space, you can effectively hit anywhere. And that's a very, very scary prospect. This fear becomes realized. And in 1957, the USSR do develop interballistic missiles. They first test them in northwest Russia. These missiles can travel 5,500 kilometers, and that was in 1957. Today, they're much more superior to that, and they're really, really, really deadly. You know, we don't need to go into all the things that have been done with them, but it's a very scary thought, isn't it? The idea of, you know, discovering space, conquering space, but then using space to launch these deadly nuclear missiles. So the space race was important for those propaganda reasons, for showing that we've conquered space, therefore we're dominant in space, we're dominant as a superpower in the world, but had some very, very real security issues. And I think that's why America and the USSR both put so much money into this. And it's really tangible of how alive that Cold War threat was. What I think is a really interesting thing to do with the space race is just to use the whole thing as a metaphor. It begins as a desire to dominate, it grows as a result of the need to outdo each other, and finally it calms down as a symbol of a new and more friendly approach. So that's the space race in a nutshell. I hope you've understood everything, and I will be doing the arms race tomorrow.